All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to another Musicians at Google event. I wanted to start off with a little bit of bad news on this April 1st. I know we have a lot of things going on today, as you can see on the Google homepage, but I just did receive word that the composer is dead. So this might turn into a CSI at Google instead of Musicians at Google, but that's okay. I'd like to introduce you to some of our friends from the San Francisco Symphony. In partnership with them, we bring you this presentation today, and it's really cool to see all of our young and future Googlers in the audience as well, so we hope you enjoy the speech. It primarily will focus in our discussion on music education and young people's participation in the symphony, which actually brings back a lot of memories for me as well. I remember growing up, I was almost afraid of the performing arts in the Cranach Center. There was actually some unfortunate incidents involving red balloons, and then I saw Peter and the Wolf, and I still feel sad about what happened to the duck to this very day. I think they get a very bad rap. But fortunately, the oboes have a much happier fate in this more recent book by Mr. Snicket. So it's with great anticipation that we bring this new book, which, as you heard, is entitled "The Composer is Dead." You learn a lot of the hidden backstory, what really happens behind a symphony orchestra. And one thing I also noticed while reading the book over the weekend is that the violas do get off really, really easily. If you played an orchestra, you know what I mean. So some minor things to note for our curtain call, a little bit of housekeeping. Please use the mic for questions and answers. We'll actually have time for some Q&A towards the end. We also are streaming this live to Googlers' desktops worldwide, so be sure to speak into the mic so they can hear your questions. Also, we are premiering an interactive element, so if you all could go to go/Snicket at your leisure. That's also the place where you can post some questions, answer some of the survey elements we're going to introduce into our talk today. And just remember one thing as you're reading the survey: no one ever suspects the sousaphones. So I'm very pleased to introduce Ron Goldman, who will talk to us more about today's program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cliff. And thanks to the entire Google community for hosting the San Francisco Symphony again. We're thrilled to be here. I'd like to send a special shout-out hello to all the kids out there. Hi, guys. The San Francisco Symphony is very much committed to providing programming of the highest quality, of course, for adults through our program, through our subscription concerts, but also, of course, to children through education programming. We do that over the entire Bay Area, but here in the South Bay, we present a special series of concerts at Flint Center in Cupertino. And through this series of concerts at the Flint Center in Cupertino, we're very, very much committed to providing the highest quality programming, both artistic and educationally, to our South Bay communities. Google employees, you should know that you get a 50% off of the price of those concerts at Flint. There's more information about that on the flyers that you have. Well, today's program is a sneak peek at one of the education concerts that's coming up at Flint. It's one of our Music for Families concerts. It takes place on April 4th. That's this Saturday, 3 o'clock. This is a program that is called The Composer is Dead. It's a program that is based on this wonderful original text by Lemony Snicket, incredible music by the composer Nathaniel Stookey, who's had a long history with the San Francisco Symphony. Maybe Nathaniel will tell us about that in a bit. Nathaniel was a member of the San Francisco Symphony Youth Orchestra in his teens. This performance of the words and music was commissioned by the San Francisco Symphony. The premiere performances were conducted by conductor Edwin Outwater. And this mighty triumvirate is back for us now to reprise that performance, but on a very special occasion, now that HarperCollins has issued the book, The Composer is Dead, along with the CD with the music, Lemony Snicket narrating, Edwin Outwater conducting the San Francisco Symphony. So this is a very special occasion for us, and we think it'll be a very special occasion for all of you Lemony Snicket fans out there. I said this was a family concert. The San Francisco Symphony does a series of family concerts, both at Flint Center in Cupertino and also, of course, at Davies Symphony Hall in San Francisco. We do that because presenting music to all ages, to all constituencies, is a part of what we do and what we are as the San Francisco Symphony. As the San Francisco Symphony, of course, we present concerts for adult art audiences at the highest levels of artistry, and at the same time, we produce education concerts, concerts that engage young people, families, parents, grandparents, people of all ages. And so you will see an example of that at the Music for Families concert on April 4th. Well, without further ado, I would like to introduce the group that I refer to as our mighty triumvirate and ask them to make their way up to the magic chairs up front. And so let's begin with, and well, this is, it is April Fool's Day, but this is not an April Fool's, I have to warn you. Lemony Snicket, the very famous author, as you know, is very shy, is prone to no shows, but we're all accustomed to that because Mr. Snicket is almost always represented by Mr. Daniel Handler, the official representative. The official representative for Mr. Snicket in all matters literary matters of law and socially. So. We also have a live composer. This is what they look like. Hello to Daniel Stookey, our composer. For Nathaniel Stookey, our composer for the composer is dead. And of course, any orchestra, any orchestral work, the San Francisco Symphony needs a great leader. And the conductor of this project is our very own conductor, Edwin Outwater. Hi, Edwin.
Hooray.
Now, this is all you're going to hear from me, but before you actually hear from them, we have a video clip for you. Thank you.
The composer is dead.
The Composer is Dead is a work for narrator and orchestra that introduces the orchestra to people who may otherwise be unfamiliar with it, or reintroduces the orchestra to people who are familiar with it.
We love classical music. We hoped that people would listen to this piece and think, gosh, that's exciting. I mean, this can do all these things that I didn't think an orchestra could do.
Composer is a word which here means a person who sits in a room muttering and humming and figuring out what notes the orchestra is going to play. This is called composing. But last night, the composer was not muttering, he was not humming, he was not moving or even breathing. This is called decomposing.
It is a piece that is designed to be performed for narrator and orchestra, and then it also exists as a recording by the San Francisco Symphony. It also exists as a book with the recording tucked into the back. And so I like to think that the live performance of the piece is kind of a butterfly, and the recording is kind of a pinning down of the butterfly. And then the book is putting the pinned butterfly in a small glass box for people to stare at.
The inspector was a very handsome and intelligent person, not unlike myself.
The Composer is Dead begins with a composer who is dead. His death is suspicious, and thus an inspector is called in, and the inspector knows there are enemies of the composer lurking in the orchestra. and so interrogates the orchestra section by section.
Perhaps the murderer is lurking in the woodwinds. Where were you last night, woodwinds? Speak up, speak up.
And each section of the orchestra provides an alibi of varying credibility and also shows off a bit in terms of its own range.
We were doing bird imitations, said the flutes, the shiniest and highest pitched of the woodwinds. It seems like that's all we ever do. Whenever the orchestra needs a bird, there we are.
Well, I like to think of the composer as dead as sort of a gateway drug that will lead to a lifelong addiction to classical music. For me, it was Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica, that kind of broke it wide open. You know, I couldn't stop listening to it. And it's like any other addiction. Before I knew it, I was listening to it alone. I was listening to it in the morning. And then slowly, I went from Beethoven to Bach. I went from Bach to Mahler. I went from Mahler to Shostakovich. See, there's something
addiction.
wrong there. And I hope that that wrong will spread like a virus.
Oh, the violas. I forgot all about you. Everyone forgets about us, said the violas bitterly. We play the notes and the chords that nobody cares about. We play crucial counter melodies nobody hears. We often have to stay late after performances and stack up all of the chairs.
The music covers quite a lot of territory because I wanted people to get the sense that the orchestra can do just about anything. There's a waltz, there's a scene in a nightclub that's basically techno. Then there's this incredibly menacing music every time he says the word dead, which is this, you know, growling,
Thundering
low brass.
fanfare of doom that I wish I could hear every time I said the word dead just in everyday life.
Who was that handsome man?
Hi, everybody. I'm Edwin, the conductor of this book and the concert coming up on Sunday. And I've been asked to kind of interview these guys. And we all kind of started this project. I guess you guys both worked with me before this project came out. First, Daniel did a Peter and the Wolf with the San Francisco Symphony, which he rewrote the words to Peter and the Wolf. And it became kind of like No Exit or A Stranger. It was very, very depressing. And we got a few complaint letters from that, and then we went on.
You did, really?
Yeah, we did.
Wow.
And then
I'm sorry, my mother has a lot of time on her hands.
So we knew we needed to move forward and do more. And Nathaniel, who was kind of from the San Francisco Symphony family, had written this wonderful piece that we had performed, and then the idea came up for this project to happen, a new work to kind of introduce the orchestra to audiences, young and old, because there are still lots of people who need to learn more about the orchestra.
In the hopes of breaking the record for complaints.
Yeah, exactly.
We could outdo ourselves.
And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today, how it works and what makes this project special. Apparently, you can answer some questions online, Cliff mentioned to me. And these are the questions. Who do you think killed the composer? What instrument do you play? And what instrument would you like to play? And we will kind of give the results of that towards the end of this presentation. And I'm speaking for all of you guys.
So you're encouraged to pay only partial attention.
Yeah. And
That's the Google way.
I know. Speaking of which, I've never been part of someone's work-life balance before, so it's really, really nice
We're more part of the work-life imbalance, I would say.
suppose.
Yeah.
So this piece, you know, there have been a lot of pieces that were written for, or some famous ones, Peter and the Wolf by Prokofiev, The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra by Benjamin Britten, pieces which introduce the different instruments, the different sounds that could be found in an orchestra. In the case of The Composer is Dead, rather than kind of going into the sounds or what the instruments sound like the oboe sounds like a duck, you guys have decided to kind of talk about the stereotypes of an orchestra in a way, which you kind of heard in the presentation, that I'm sure there's some sort of corporate culture in Google, so Google in-jokes, which I may learn about by the end of the day. But in orchestras, certainly there are many jokes and kind of stereotypes of the instruments. You may have noticed the violas were referred to as kind of losers of the orchestra. And in fact, if you go on, for instance, viola.com, you will see a list of hundreds and hundreds of viola jokes. It's kind of a thing in the orchestra world. One such joke is, you know, you're driving a car, you see a conductor and a violist in the road. Who do you run over first? And the answer is the conductor, business before pleasure. So that's kind of this, and it goes on and on. So, and the flutes are kind of uptight and depressed, even though they play happy music all the time. The brass players are arrogant jerks. So what made you decide that angle, and kind of what brought you into
We got together in a cafe in Haight.
Yes.
And basically, because I'd played in an orchestra, I gave Daniel everything that I knew. Daniel's also a musician, so knew a fair number of these things beforehand. But I think, for instance, the composer decomposing is an old orchestra joke. And the viola stereotype is certainly that's the pillar of orchestra lore, in a way.
Yeah, I grew up as a boy soprano in the San Francisco Boys Chorus. I played 3 seasons of them all, and I'm all the night visitors in the Oakland Opera. I have my clippings with me if people would like to see them after. And then puberty came along and wrecked my career. And it had never really occurred to me when I was a boy soprano that it could go downhill so quickly. Unlike playing just about any other instrument, you can keep it going. You can't actually, once if you're a man and you develop your secondary sex characteristics, that's the end of your career as a soprano.
Sorry.
My parents say that they considered castration to keep my career going, but they didn't do it. And so I think I funneled some of that bitterness and jealousy towards people who do anything else but sing in the world of classical music to exploit the stereotypes while working on this piece. And the piece has been performed all over the place. I have stepped in for Lemony Snicket, performing it on a number of occasions, and every time that I have, at least one person in the orchestra has told me that they're offended. So, in that way,
especially the
piece
concertmaster,
is a success.
who gets a very bad rap.
Yeah, and well, there's always someone who's offended. It's the text of the piece says that there are 2 kinds of violins. There are the first violins who have the trickier parts to play, and the second violins who are more fun at parties. And a second violinist came up to me and said that she just wanted me to know that wasn't true, that it was only that the first violins had the higher parts and the second violins had slightly lower parts. And I said, that, don't worry, no one would ever think she was more fun at parties. And that didn't really resolve the conflict, surprisingly. But there have been various complaints with each orchestra. So I like to think that that's the piece of succeeded.
It's hitting home.
Yeah.
I think the words definitely kind of covered, and it's really like an insider's look into orchestra life, because orchestras are interesting things. I mean, when we're an orchestra, as an orchestra musician, people ask us to this day, you know, is this a full-time job? You know, what do you do? Do you sell frozen yogurt after the rehearsal? And of course, an orchestra like the San Francisco Symphony is a group of musicians who are like athletes. You know, there's incredibly difficult auditions to get into the orchestra. They play a different concert every single week,
or more than one.
Yeah, or more than one. Like this Lemony Snicket project. In fact, this week there are 2 separate orchestras going on at the San Francisco Symphony. They're split in 2, and so this book kind of, more than any other book, kind of gets into that world. And I want to talk a little bit about the music, Nat, because when you came in here, there was this beautiful background music going on. to get you comfortable and relaxed, which happened to be Beethoven and Brahms and Mozart. And I wonder what they would have thought of that, to have their music be background music at Google. The conductor...
Or in a book.
Or in a book, yeah. The conductor, Daniel Barenboim, kind of left the country because he was so offended by hearing classical music as background music, because obviously it's very far kind of from where it was first intended to be written. And your music, it's not background music, I think. So how did you use the music? Did you start with the words, or did you write the music around the words?
Yeah, definitely. We talked first, and then Daniel sent me a draft, which I butchered. And the good thing is, since Daniel was an opera fan, he was kind of expecting his words to be butchered so that the music could be paced.
And also because I've known you for a long time. Nathaniel and I went to high school together and then didn't keep in touch. And now I think both of us kind of wish it had just gone on that way. But so he was presented with a draft of the text, and then he would invite me over to his house. It's awful. I would get upset about it if I thought about it. And then he would invite me over to his house, and he would prepare strange meals from oddball vegetables found in local markets. And then he would play me a bit of the piece, sometimes on the piano and sometimes on some very bad software used to mimic the sound of an orchestra. Terrible. Probably made by Yahoo, if you know what I'm saying. And then he would say, you see now how the words need to be changed. And I would say, not a single syllable, you cur. And you have to change every single note in this piece. You've gotten it all wrong. And he would say, not a single note, I am the genius here. And then we would have some beer. I can say that in front of young people, right? You shouldn't have any, but it's okay for me to have as much as I want. And then I would say, all right, just a few words. And he would say, okay, just a few notes. And from that, the collaboration was hammered down. Hammered down, with the emphasis on the word hammered, I guess.
And your music, Nat, I mean, when you were writing the music, were you thinking of kids? Were you thinking of adults? Like, were you thinking?
I was thinking most of all of the players in the orchestra, because I wanted it to be fun for them. There's a lot of crappy children's music that they have to play, and I wanted this to be something that they could sink their teeth into. The jokes are kind of inside jokes for them, and I actually wrote to the principals of the symphony and got in trouble for doing that. But some of the players wrote back to me, like the tuba player, who has a great solo in this piece, wrote me back and said, sure, I'll meet with you. So we met, and I said, what do you most want to play? What would you really love to play that you never get to play? And
they said the guitar. Sorry, I just...
Just like the poll that we're asking you to do, which instrument do you want to play? He said, so anyway, that's, I really wrote it first for the players. Second, probably for people of our generation who never go to the symphony.
Which generation are we?
I don't know, whichever.
We're very young.
We're the youngest people here. And then probably lastly for my kids' generation, who are important too, but I was actually thinking most of friends of mine who never go to the symphony first, and then hopefully they bring their kids as well. And
so how you're writing for people who don't go to the symphony, what does that mean? Are you writing music that they've heard before, or kind of integrating to lure them in, or are you writing something that they just think they'll like? Or
I guess I wasn't that calculating. I mean, it was really more fun for me. I started from the words, which are fun to begin with, and I wanted to write music that was fun. But yeah, it does cover kind of a wide range from, well, like this interview, earlier interview says, techno and waltz. There's a lot of dance music in it.
So what are your techno influences?
You'd have to... I don't know what my influences are. Daniel knows a lot more about my influences probably than I do.
What are Nat's influences?
What are my techno influences, Daniel?
It's just because I read his diary. Derek May? No, I don't know. I guess the idea in incorporating different styles was to become less lonely, frankly, because
when you're interested in classical music, as the three of us are, people look at you funny. So if you go and you are sitting with friends, and you all might talk about things that you've read in a magazine, and then everyone's on the same page, and then you might talk about television, and everyone's talking about that too, and then you might talk about pop music, and everyone's kind of friendly, and then if someone says, yeah, it actually reminds me of that Shostakovich quartet there at the end, slowly everyone... There's a tangible feeling that changes in the room.
I hate that.
And it's a terrible feeling. It's very, very
alienating.
lonely. Yeah. Yes. If there were a campus, say, for classical music lovers, it would be a lot smaller, and the food would be a lot worse than the campus that we're on now. And so I just thought that if I seduced more people into the world of classical music, then maybe I wouldn't be as lonely and wretched as I am now.
So, yeah, it's kind of sad. I had kind of the same background. I mean, for me, came to classical music later. I was kind of a rock kid, and my dad worked for a record company, and I think my first concert was Alice Cooper or something, because, and you still...
Yeah, for those who don't know who she is.
She is like fantastic.
Wonderful soprano.
School's out for summer.
No.
But I think we got pulled in, at one point. I don't know. Did you hear classical? See, Daniel's also works a lot with rock musicians. You write about rock music sometimes. He was at one point working on a compilation of 80s synth pop, for Rhino Records, which may or may not come out. You play with the Magnetic Field, Stephen Merritt. So did you come to rock first, or did you come to classical first?
No, I came to classical music first. I only listened to classical music, and in fact, it was my friend David Fisher in 6th grade, who I'm sure you all know. He said to me, he gave me an album by Men at Work, and he said, you have to start listening to pop music or no one's going to like you. That's the kind of loneliness and desolation that I'm talking about. I'm not sure actually that in the long run my deep love for Shostakovich has served me not as well as listening to the Men at Work album. I'm not sure actually listening to Men at Work now makes you any cooler. But I didn't hear any popular music at all until I was entering teenagerdom. Which is also something to be said about background music. There was less of it. Nowadays, you can not... Sometimes I'll read about a hit song and I think I won't have heard it, and then I'll hear it and I realize I've heard it 1,000 times because there's so many opportunities to hear music. But when I was growing up, there wasn't as much music constantly in the air all the time. And so I only listened to classical music and then came into pop.
Yeah.
There's still big swaths of pop music I'm ignorant of because my parents didn't listen to it. Neil Diamond, Barbra Streisand. I don't know. I couldn't name. Yeah, Led Zeppelin.
Britney. Only I listen to Britney.
I don't think.
Yeah, you have the weirdest musical taste of anyone I've ever met, Nat. I mean, because you actually don't listen to a lot of music, which is kind of cool. I mean.
In a way.
In a way, no, because I think Daniel and I are more similar because we'll go to Amoeba Records and have you heard this? Have you heard this? Kind of like consuming stuff. Whereas you actually consume very little music as kind of comes in. You're much more kind of creating music.
The only time I hear music is at dance clubs. That's why I'm familiar with the work of Ms. Spears. Or at concert halls. So yeah, but I don't listen to a lot of recorded music.
So you're obsessed, for instance, with the Umbrella song, Rihanna.
I am. I think it's fantastic. Yeah.
And did that make its way, some of this Britney and Rihanna, into your music?
I don't know. Well, you asked earlier about my influences, and I wouldn't say that I have specific influences. In that, I mean, the fact that I don't listen to recorded music means I most often don't know what I'm listening to because I can't pick up the CD or the look on iTunes at what it is. It's just kind of all in the mix. If I'm at a club. All these things are kind of drifting around. So, no, not in any specific way.
Mm-hmm. So,
do you want me to get your questions that you dropped?
No, that's just my rundown.
All right.
So, what would you like to?
I felt bad for you when it dropped. I thought, we go.
I've heard that.
It's all over.
I know. Anyway, so I just learned. Can I say this? Can I talk about what might happen with this book?
Sure.
You have all these ideas. One of which is there's going to be a puppet show of this piece coming up.
I am. I'm working with some puppeteers because the goal of the piece was to bring this music to
a lot of people, and one of the stumbling blocks that I didn't anticipate was that there's so many places where it's really not, they don't have a symphony orchestra, and it's not feasible to bring a symphony orchestra there. And that was a source of frustration for me, because when I go and talk about the Lemony Snicket books, I go all over the place. I go to towns that don't have bookstores or libraries, and as well as big cities and suburbia and all these places. And so I thought, well, how hard can it be to bring a whole symphony orchestra with you? As it turns out, kind of hard. So glad
well,
you
also,
asked.
you know, sorry, the piece itself is not easy to play. In
Right.
fact, it takes more time than, it's actually quite difficult to pull off.
And that people kept saying, couldn't you just bring a piano player? And I said, well, it's hard to play a piece that introduces the orchestra instrument by instrument and only have one instrument.
Much as we'd love to.
Yeah. I said it in a more incredulous tone of voice the first time they asked me. And so we had this recording, and I had an idea that we had the recording so we could bring it. And so at first I thought, well, you could have an orchestra kind of lip syncing, or not, bow syncing and
Air violin.
fingering.
Like the inauguration.
Yeah. But that didn't seem feasible either. And then I met these puppeteers. They came to me through the world of music. They're called Phantom Limb. I'm sure people are looking it up right now online. Phantom Limb, and it's a married couple who makes these puppets, and the husband used to be the bass player in the Lounge Lizards, which was a band I liked a lot. Eric Sanko. Glad to see someone's representing for the Lounge Lizards here. And so they're making puppets, and I hope that we'll bring the puppet show everywhere. They're really, really awesome looking puppets.
That could be lonelier than being a classical musician, to talk about.
Well, that was actually
puppets
what was
at the
nice
table.
about talking to puppeteers, is when I told them about my loneliness, there was a pause, and then he explained to me that he used to be the bass player for this punk jazz band, and he'd now moved into the world of puppets. So I actually had found a lonelier soul than I.
Well, I'd like
So
to
I hardly ever call him. I'm in the popular crowd compared to him.
I want to talk about one specific part of this piece, because we're coming to the end of this interview segment. Even though I dropped my sheet of paper, I do remember that. And it's the kind of grand finale of this piece, Nat, that you composed, and which I think you're going to kind of perform in
Yes.
just a little bit. And it's kind of the funeral march. Of course, as you might imagine, the end of this piece involves a funeral march, and kind of a listing of all the composers who are dead. Because another thing about being a classical musician is you're working mostly with dead artists, and you're trying to figure out what they meant when they wrote it, because they didn't, there are no recordings of Brahms. There were some, maybe one or two recordings of his friend Joachim, who played his violin concerto. But anyway, and what you did was really extraordinary. You took, as each composer is named off, you took an excerpt of his music. They're all male in this case, and kind of put a mosaic of music together out of their pieces in the original key. Now that's difficult, actually, because these pieces are all in different keys. So to make it all come together as exact quotes is kind of an incredibly difficult puzzle to solve, which is what you're going to hear. So every time you hear the composer's name, you'll hear his music played. And what was that like doing that? I mean, that just seems unbelievably tricky.
It was by far the hardest part to write, even though I didn't write any of it. Because I really wanted, even though this is a silly piece, I wanted this to be a tribute to these composers, and also to the players who are used to playing these things. They have this music in their fingers, and you don't want it transposed. They want it where it belongs. And so it was a huge puzzle to try and figure out how to put this together and to get it to flow. There are 13 excerpts. But the good thing about it, from my point of view, is that I can listen to it in this way, and then when you put Daniel's words on top of it, it suddenly becomes this hilarious thing. And somehow that does, those two poles don't detract for me. I think one of the great things about music is that it has this potential to express wildly different things, and that though people may think of classical music as being stodgy or having a particular sort of mood about it, it can really, you have this huge palette and you can do pretty much whatever you want with it.
Well, I've always thought that horror and hilarity were more or less the same thing. And it's true that towards the end of The Composer is Dead, it becomes clear that the composer's death is part of a conspiracy and that practically every composer you've heard of is dead. And so when I pointed that out to Nathaniel, he began to start working on this funeral march that is this kind of mashup of different excerpts that are all by the composers named and are all pieces about death. And I was really worrying for him when he was working on it, because previously he'd been fairly calm. He had a piano where he kind of tries out a few things, and then this software that helps him keep all the parts straight. But other than that, he's just kind of muttering and humming to himself like we all do, or the two of us do anyway. And then when he started working on this, I would go and visit him, and he had borrowed all these scores from libraries and friends and things that were all spread out all over the place, and he was kind of trying to combine them all into this thing, and I realized that I had suggested the idea that it was a conspiracy of dead composers, and that this idea was going to engulf him and kill him. But he did survive so far, knock plastic. But what it was fascinating to see that he was trying to work all of these other composers in there together. It was a scary thing. It was kind of like, you know, when you might have a suspicious tenant, and then you go into his apartment just to check, and he has like a bunch of pictures of the president or something. It had that kind of creepy feeling about it, that he had all these scores of dead composers, and that he was working on this piece about death. And
bad karma.
And in some way it was a triumph, because how I knew him in high school is that he was tall and blonde and fluent in French, and he could have any girl that he wanted. So
So you saw me reduced to this kind of serial killer.
It was
flogging,
kind of satisfying.
putting push pins in the map.
Yeah, and then our reunion was coming up meanwhile, so I was confident that he would be a trembling figure. But he's recuperated more or less. So now I'll perform that part. As you can see, there's no orchestra here, so we're using the recording. But I'll play the part of the narrator, and you'll play the part of the audience.
Have we ever tried this?
No.
No.
I think this is a
I've never done this before in my life. Oh, there it went. Start it over, please. Beethoven, dead. Bach, dead. Brahms, dead. Mozart's dead. Haydn, dead. Schubert, unfinished but dead. Mahler, dead. Chopin, romantic, dead. Tchaikovsky, dramatic, dead. Stravinsky, ecstatic, dead. Schoenberg, incomprehensible, but dead. Berlioz, dead. Purcell, dead. Prokofiev, dead. Vivaldi, dead. Sibelius, Ives, Handel, Britten, Mendelssohn, Scriabin, Liszt, Messiaen, Copland, Cage, Dvorak, Shostakovich, Ligeti, Rossini, Puccini, Bellini, J.C. Bach, W.F. Bach, C.P.E. Bach, Offenbach, Corelli. Dead composers litter the musical world, and it's all because of one man, the murderer himself. Arrest him at once! Not so fast, said the entire orchestra in unison. The murderer didn't work alone.
All of us have butchered a composer at one time or another. But we also keep composers alive. Without strings and woodwinds, without brass and percussion, there would be no composing at all. Except for various kinds of non-orchestral music. If you want to hear the work of the world's greatest composers, you're going to have to allow for a little murder here and there. But that's injustice. Those who want justice, said the orchestra, can go to the police. But those who want something a little more interesting than justice should go to the orchestra.
That was great.
That was very strange to
I know,
do
it
it
must
without
have
an
been
orchestra.
weird.
It was very strange.
I
Also,
would-
I made some textual
I noticed that.
Didn't give away.
changes so
Yeah.
as not to give away the end of the episode of Murder, She Wrote before we reached it.
Well, it's even better live, and it's this Saturday at 3, just
At the
nearby
Flint
at
Center.
Cupertino, so we invite you all to come.
Named after the device
Here.
used to make fire.
That's where technology started.
Yeah,
Right at the Flint
that's right.
Center. Yeah.
And a lovely town in
And its
Michigan.
end point is Google. It started with fire, and you're the end.
It's very morbid. So, do we have our poll results? Speaking of technology, yeah.
This just in.
So now, if you want to vote as I am reading the results, this is live questioning with Google Moderator at go/Snicket. The first question, shall we do the, we'll start out with the easy one. Did you play an instrument growing up? The clear winner is the piano. It seems to be the popular thing, though harder to carry these days.
What were the next ones?
And then we had guitar, and then my personal favorite, the cello.
That was 3?
That was 3.
Ahead of violin. Interesting.
And then,
For those of you who have kids, don't teach them the violin. Teach them the bassoon, or the bass clarinet, or the trombone. We need those. We need those in the orchestra. I used to run a youth orchestra there.
You would feel differently.
Well, I don't know, because we have all these kids lining up to audition for youth symphony. They all play violin, bassoon, viola. Sorry, they might get beaten up though. In that
Comb
case.
and tissue paper.
Yeah.
yes, or the musical saw, as in one of the
That's a good
productions
one.
I've seen. And then we had
He
the
plays the saw.
saxophone rounding out the folks that didn't play an instrument or played the flute. So, on the other hand,
Wait, people who didn't play an instrument played the saxophone?
well, it depends on what you're listening to, but yeah, there were more saxophone players than folks that did not play an instrument.
Oh.
It's the Lisa Simpson influence, I think.
Basically, yeah. And then
Or John Coltrane.
Yeah, it could be.
in terms of the instruments of people's dreams, so once again, my personal favorite, although the bassoon was a close, not on the list, the cello rounded out first, and we had the piano and drums, followed by the one of the more difficult instruments in the orchestra, which is the air guitar, violin beating out the pipe organ. So,
In real life, the violin could never beat out the pipe organ.
just by force of sheer numbers, it's just not going to happen.
It would be it's the pipes, really. Yeah.
The pipes will do you in.
Yeah.
And then finally, the question of who done it. This voted by the results of Google Moderator through Google offices worldwide. Start to place the first finger. There actually is a tie, so 2 fingers going at 2 different murderers. The first one being Mr. Lemony Snicket. What can I say?
I'll pass that along.
Yes. We'll try to find him after the show. And then also the sousaphones. Like I said in my intro, no one suspects the sousaphones. Then the violas in the audience rounding out some sort of co-conspiracy at
Wow.
the end. So those are our questions. We also have time for some Q&A from the audience, and also for our remote offices, you can put your questions in on go/Snicket. Thank you.
This part's awkward.
Yeah.
You don't have to have any
Alternatively.
questions. Yeah, that's the great thing about America.
Go get some free cookies.
We went and did this in Saudi Arabia, and everyone had to ask questions. But here in America, you don't have to.
Yeah.
Question?
Read one from the.
Sure. I think you have to read it into the microphone for
Posterity.
posterity. Yeah, we wouldn't want to lose this.
Well, I don't have any questions of my own, but somebody asked, are there any plans to extend the performance dates?
Well, not extend the performance dates in that we can't camp out at the Flint Center and see if more people are up for it. But the piece has been performed all over the place, all over America, and it was the most performed piece of new music last year, which is a little bit like being the world's tallest midget, but it's still nevertheless impressive.
And it premiered in German.
Premiered in
last season.
German.
It also premiered in Australian.
Yes, so you should, if you live on Earth, it will be more or less convenient to go see it. I mean,
It's
depends
not like
where
a Broadway
you live on
run.
Earth.
You kind of have to wait and.
Yeah.
But it's come back.
Could you say a little more about the difficulty of performing this? This subject just came up. There's a new Naxos recording of some wind band music, and the composer was talking about why he was so pleased to compose for a wind band, because he could get their attention to actually rehearse a really complicated piece, and orchestras only get to play something 3 times. And
Yeah, a lot of, since we're doing a different concert every week at the San Francisco Symphony, we have a limited amount of time to prepare it. And sometimes, the orchestras are such virtuosos, they can often play things really quickly. In one rehearsal of a Beethoven symphony, or even in a read-through of a Beethoven symphony with San Francisco, I would say 70% of our audience couldn't tell the difference, of what we actually work on. It's kind of like this higher stuff, these ultra-refined things, just because the players are great. When it's a new piece, it takes a little bit more time. So what made it challenging is that there's no collective memory of the piece for the orchestra when we play it. Though we did it this time, we had done it 3 years ago, and they actually remembered a great deal of the piece, even though they played 40, the hundreds and hundreds of pieces in between, which is kind of what's so amazing about an orchestra. And I find usually the more complex the music is as far as writing, the more hard it is to play sometimes. This idea of Nats to combine this kind of mosaic of composers was the hardest part to rehearse. The Rite of Spring Stravinsky excerpt is often done in different meters. We had to do it. It was notated differently, so the players were seeing this kind of piece turned upside down in front of them. Actually, some of them screamed playing the Rite of Spring in 4, because it's usually in 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So, but it's a thrill, and that's what makes orchestral music, I think, has a level of complexity that I could objectively say, having listened to all sorts of music and loving all sorts of music, has a level of complexity that other kinds of music don't have as far as how they're put together. Now, jazz can be incredibly complex if it needs be, or a great guitar solo, but there's something about the notes being written down and combined on the page from Bach's point way back. There's that connection between mathematics and music that makes classical music particularly challenging, I think.
And I think also because it's a piece for children, that some orchestras think, oh, well, how complicated can it be? Which reminds me
They
a
tend
lot.
to pigeonhole.
Yeah. So then we get there and they say, oh gosh, it's very hard. It actually reminds me a little bit of having children. You think, well, you need like a little bed, right? And then you're kind of done. And it turns out, my son's 5 now, and he's still shaky on the difference between sweet and dry vermouth. I don't know how many times I have to go over with him.
Did you have another question?
Let's see, I'll start out with a word of warning. I've never encountered a puppet orchestra that can handle anything written in A sharp, so,
Good to know.
Second, as a former tuba player, I thank you for corresponding with them and
My pleasure.
checking
Great
out.
instrument.
They're very rarely heard from. My question was, there's a sort of tradition of combining humor and music with people like Anna Russell and Peter Schickele, and I wonder if you drew on them at all, if you're familiar with them.
I didn't really. As Edwin said earlier, I spend all day writing music, so I don't really have a lot left to listen to music. I did meet Peter Schickele when I was working with the North Carolina Symphony, and I admire what he does, but I couldn't say that I really know what he does enough to be influenced by it particularly. What really guided me were Daniel's words.
And would you find that humor makes its way into your music generally, or is this an exception?
Well, this maybe has more, but I do think that music can express anything, and that we, the idea that classical music especially has to be serious and highbrow and high-minded all the time, I think is limiting it. So yeah, I think a lot of my music has little sections that are quirky, and then sections that for me at least, writing them, are moving. I wouldn't say that I was really looking at people who do one kind of thing. If anything, my model would be Mozart.
He's good.
He's good.
Also funny.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean. That's what I mean. And that he had a sense of humor. It wasn't just like, this is fun music, or this is kids music, this is grown-up music, this is serious music, this is new music, which means it's one kind of way. I wanted it to be just, bigger, rounder.
It's one of the admirable things about Nathaniel Stookey's music, is that it crosses a lot of boundaries. In fact, the first commission that he received after this commission from the San Francisco Symphony was to become the first composer in residence at the San Francisco City Dump.
Yeah. So you can go listen to Junkestra, which is somewhere online at Sunset Scavenger, and here it's a very different thing, because it's different, a different brief.
So it's all instruments made of junk, by the way.
Yeah.
So my son was pretty into classical music when he was like 3, 4, 5. I guess it was just very visceral, and he enjoyed that part of it. But now at 7, 8, it's got no lyrics, so he's not interested in it. It's boring.
You try to raise him right.
So the answer, obvious answer is, well, opera. But that has its issues. Most of which is that it's not in English and he can't understand any of it. So can you throw out any pieces with actual, narration or opera in English that might be, appealing or interesting to the same age group that this appeals to?
A piece for narrator and orchestra.
I think you kind of are tapping into a bigger subject with kids and music. I think if my dad gave me anything to listen to, I would be like, no. When I was a little kid, and in fact, my parents tried to play classical music for me when I was young, and I would turn off the radio. I wouldn't listen to it just because of the way in which it was being transmitted to me as a kid. And I found myself coming back to it at around 14, just through my friends and through playing music in the schools, and it kind of took me. But I think if my parents hadn't played it for me when I was younger, that maybe wouldn't have primed me to accept it later on in life, And I think the visceral comment is also interesting, because there's this weird culture that's evolved around classical music that it's not visceral, which is actually not. The composers would be shocked to know that, because what's more visceral than 100 people like playing together in a live kind of situation? Compared to rock and roll, I know what you mean. There's not a beat or this or that, but I think all three of our missions in life is the music actually has fundamentally visceral qualities and fun qualities, but the culture around the music, like this kind of stilted background music that we heard as we walked in, or this kind of atmosphere that has developed in the concert hall over the years that has to do with kind of Edith Wharton novels, this dressy, or if you clap in between
Which
movies.
I would also add are also grossly misinterpreted.
They are, yeah,
People
they
are poisoning each other in Edith Wharton novels all the time.
But it's kind of a mission, you know.
Yeah. There's not, when people think Edith Wharton novel, they think, oh, Lord Worthington. When actually, it's this backstabbing murder. It's great.
Yeah. But there's this culture that grows up around art that makes it untouchable. People who are really fans of it treat it and put it up on a pedestal. Or you're not supposed to clap in between movements. Someone told me that once. I was conducting a Mozart concert, and this woman said, what do you think of the people clapping in between the Mozart symphony? I said, well, you know, I liked it. And Mozart actually liked it too, because in Mozart's time, people not only clapped in between movements, they encored the movements. They would clap until you had to play it again. And that's totally vanished. And I would much rather hear applause in between movements than candy wrappers and coughing, which is the thing that's developed in place of that. I think it's absolutely bizarre, you know. But for kids, I love Rite of Spring, man. That's my piece.
Oh, that's
it.
true. That's
yeah.
fun.
I wouldn't go with the lyrics
No
thing,
lyrics, yeah.
because if you try to find something with lyrics, it's just not going to satisfy them, because they're not going to be lyrics that they want to hear about. I don't know. You said he's 8, so like fast women and souped up cars. You know, you're not going to find the right lyrics. So I would just like go for music that the Rite of Spring I think would be great. It's really intense.
Rite of Spring. Like if you've never been to an orchestra concert, you want to see something, you want to bring your kids, go see that piece. It's a great starter for the 21st century, even though it was written.
Yeah, stay
It's
away
a starter for
from
the 20th.
Stay away from things like this.
Yeah.
Did you have a question?
Yeah,
I think we're almost.
Yeah, I had a question. Most of the classical music I've heard has been background music, you know, and I can say I like that or I don't like that, but I get the feeling there's a whole lot more to appreciating them, the structure that goes into the music, and you know, knowing movements versus you know, all the different musical forms. How does one learn about that in order to appreciate the music itself better?
I don't think you have to. Is how I feel, but I may get some argument with my
totally agree with
co-team
you.
I agree.
members. But it's because I listen to classical music all the time and often am completely ignorant of its structures and its work. So in the way that there are people who think that if you don't know how a recording studio works, you can never have a true appreciation of the White Album. It's not true, you know. But I mean, you meet audiophiles all the time who say, "Oh, it's the production on this," and I think, turn it up, please.
If there is one thing, I see you have a child on your lap. It's learning music.
Yeah.
I mean, my son asks me this all the time. How come I have to have music lessons? And he never comes to me and says, how come I have to do long division? It just doesn't occur to him. Everyone around him has to do long division, so does he. And the more you know, if you know the language, you're gonna respond to it that much more so. But I don't think it should prevent you from enjoying it on other levels.
And I think, you know, for me, when I wanted to learn more, I read liner notes. It was very simple. It's like there's a lot of information out about the music, and the more you're into it, just little bits online. Of course, there are 100 things. On Dante.com, I think, has 1 million composer
search
write-ups.
on, you know, Hotbot or Lycos, one of the great.
Yahoo's good.
One of the really
I
great
think, for
search
that.
engines.
Lexus,
Yeah.
Nexus.
All right,
It's all out there.
and to build off that, of course, one of our questions on the door, he did mention Leonard Bernstein did a fabulous series of recordings on introducing young people.
On DVD, yeah. They're called Young People's Concerts with the New York Philharmonic.
And then the final parting thought, the inspiration hit me as I was sitting here in the talk. One way that the literary world is bringing a new audience to the 21st century is a book that just recently came out that's called Pride and Prejudice and Zombies.
Yeah, that's good.
So I think maybe we might
would
be on
also
something
be a
big
great
here.
puppet show.
Yeah, exactly. So we could have like Claude Debussy and
Reader,
zombies.
I ate him.
Yeah.
So, on that note, on behalf of the musicians at Google and the San Francisco Symphony, we want to thank you, gentlemen, for speaking with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. You dropped your wallet.